thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word. A dark idea took root as civilization began to dawn. This isn't just a story about one empire or a single moment in time. It's the story of an impulse that's been with us for as long as we've had something to take. So, when did humans first decide to own each other? The answer isn't just about war and conquest. It's tied to the very revolution that allowed our societies to grow. For most of our time on Earth, we were hunters and gatherers. While some groups were nomadic, others settled where resources were rich. But they all had one thing in common: not much extra stuff. In a world where you only had what you could carry, and finding food was a full-time job, a captive was just another mouth to feed. Large-scale, systematic slavery simply didn't make economic sense. This isn't to say conflict and captive-taking never happened. Some societies, particularly in resource-rich areas like the Pacific Northwest, did practice forms of slavery tied to status and raiding even before agriculture. But the widespread institution of slavery, where people are treated like livestock, couldn't take hold on a massive scale. For that to happen, the world needed to change. That change began around 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent with the Neolithic Revolution. As humans learned to farm and domesticate animals, our whole way of life was rewritten. This happened at different times across the globe, but the result was the same. For the first time, we could produce more food than we needed to survive day to day. That surplus was the crucial spark. Suddenly, societies could support bigger populations and specialized jobs. You had priests, soldiers, artisans, and rulers. With surplus came wealth, and with wealth came the desire to protect and grow it. In this new world of haves and have-nots, the brutal math of slavery finally added up. A captive taken in a raid wasn't just a burden anymore. They could be forced to work the fields or build cities, producing far more value than they cost to keep alive. Agriculture didn't invent cruelty, but it created the economic conditions that turned human bondage from a sporadic practice into a profitable, larger-scale institution. The practice of slavery is much older than writing, but the first time we see it carved into law is in ancient Mesopotamia. Here, the idea of owning another person became a formal legal reality. Some of the earliest surviving written evidence comes from the Sumerians. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from around 2100 BCE, is one of the oldest law codes we've ever found, and it includes provisions related to slaves. Its fragmented laws mention penalties and rules concerning enslaved people, showing that slavery wasn't just an informal practice, was already integrated into the social and economic order, enough to need state regulation. A few centuries later, around 1754 BCE, the famous Code of Hammurabi of Babylon gave us even more detail. Law 15 is chillingly clear. If a free person helps a slave of either a palace or a civil servant escape, that person shall be executed. This is one of the earliest and most explicit surviving examples of human trafficking being enshrined in law. The state's power wasn't used to protect the enslaved person. It was used to protect the owner's property rights. Helping a slave escape what wed, now call trafficking, was a capital offense against the owner. So how did you become a slave in the ancient world? The routes were brutal and numerous. The most common was through war. For centuries, the spoils of war were land, treasure, and people. Armies would capture entire populations, march them across deserts and seas, and sell them in city markets. Their names, families, and identities were stripped away, and they became chattel-living property. But war wasn't the only way. Debt was another. In many ancient societies, if you couldn't pay what you owed, you could be forced to sell yourself or even your children into servitude. This debt bondage was a constant threat hanging over the poor, and perhaps most cruelly, you could simply be born into it. In most slave systems, the child of an enslaved mother automatically became the property of her owner, creating a self-perpetuating institution where a supply of enslaved people was always guaranteed. As civilizations grew, so did their reliance on forced labor. When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably picture slaves building the pyramids. The reality is a bit more complex. Most historians now think the Great Pyramids were built by paid laborers, possibly as a form of citizen labor tax. However, forced labor from prisoners of war was still common in other areas, like mines and huge agricultural estates. In classical Greece and Rome, the institution was even more central. Athens, a democracy for a select few, ran on the backs of a huge enslaved population, working in silver mines, workshops, and homes. The Roman Empire was a true slave society. Scholars debate the exact numbers, but it's estimated that enslaved people made up a significant portion of the population, with some high-end estimates suggesting as much as a third of the population in parts of Italy at certain times. This pattern didn't end with Rome. In the early medieval period, Viking raiders terrorized the coasts of Europe, not just for gold, but for people. Captives from Britain, France, and Spain were sold in slave markets that stretched as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. It's from this broader era that we get the English word slave. It comes from the medieval Latin word sclavus, which originally meant Slav, because so many Slavic peoples from Eastern Europe were captured and sold into bondage during the early Middle Ages. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, huge and sophisticated slave trading networks already spanned the globe. The Trans-Saharan trade route was a brutal conveyor belt for human lives. For centuries, people captured in sub-Saharan Africa were forced on a death march across the world's largest hot desert to markets in North Africa. The Greek historian Herodotus even wrote about the peoples and trade south of the Sahara back in the 5th century BCE, though he didn't describe the full system that would later emerge. At the same time, the Indian Ocean trade connected East Africa to Arabia, Persia, and India, carrying not just spices and ivory, but enslaved human beings. Starting in the 7th century, the Arab slave trade dramatically expanded these existent routes, creating a system that lasted for over 1,000 years. While the exact numbers are still debated by historians, it moved millions of people, primarily from Africa and Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, fundamentally shaping the demographics and economies of multiple continents. These networks are a stark reminder that large-scale human trafficking was a global business long before the modern era. The transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 16th century, was built on these older models, but evolved into something uniquely horrifying. Over nearly 4 centuries, based on current data from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, European traders forcibly embarked around 12.5 million Africans for transport across the Atlantic. What made this system different was its industrial scale and, crucially, its racial ideology. While slavery had always been brutal, the transatlantic system became explicitly and legally racialized. A twisted justification was developed to portray Africans as subhuman, thereby rationalizing their permanent, heritable enslavement. The sheer mortality rate of this trade was staggering. The voyage across the ocean, the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of disease, starvation, and violence. Historical estimates suggest that around 2 million men, women, and children died before they even reached the Americas, their bodies thrown into the ocean. This wasn't just trafficking. It was a demographic catastrophe engineered for profit, creating a system of chattel slavery that would define the Americas for generations. It's a brutal question, but what was a person worth in this marketplace? The price has fluctuated wildly throughout history, reflecting the cold economics of exploitation. Today, the economics of slavery have flipped. Modern trafficking isn't built on long-term ownership, but on short-term, high-volume exploitation. The price of a trafficking victim today can be shockingly low, sometimes just a few $100s. This isn't a purchase price. For a lifetime, it's the cost of acquiring a disposable person. The profit comes from the continuous exploitation of their body or labor, often until they are physically and mentally broken. This horrifyingly low price tag reveals the core logic of modern slavery. Human beings are treated as a disposable commodity. Today, chattel slavery is officially illegal in every country, but slavery is far from over. It's just changed its form. Modern slavery, or human trafficking, is a hidden crime that thrives in the shadows of our global economy. The United Nations defines it as the recruitment, transport, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. That exploitation can be forced labor on farms or in factories, sexual exploitation, or forced marriage and domestic servitude. While the laws have changed, the core drivers are the same as they were thousands of years ago: economic demand and the dehumanization of the vulnerable. Traffickers prey on poverty, instability, and conflict, promising a better life but delivering a nightmare. The very industries, like agriculture and manufacturing, that first gave rise to slavery are still rife with forced labor today. The story of human trafficking didn't end with abolition. The chains just became invisible. The desire to own and exploit another human being isn't an ancient relic. It's a dark thread woven through our entire history, from the first agricultural surpluses to the global supply chains of the 21st century. It began when we first created a world of haves and have-nots. It was codified in our earliest laws, built empires, and fueled economies. And today, it continues in the shadows, preying on the same vulnerabilities it always has. The fight against slavery isn't a battle that was won in the past. It is a struggle that continues right now, and it demands our awareness and our action.